How to keep yourself free. Complete watch this video. The sky above the village of Sarnath was always vast and open, like the dreams of Ane, a young man who was determined to live life on his own terms. From a young age, Ane had been told what to do, how to behave, what to study, who to respect, and what kind of future was best for him. These instructions came from well-meaning parents, cautious teachers, religious elders, and every adult who believed they had already seen enough of the world to know what was best for someone like Ane. But in the corners of his quiet mind, Ane carried questions, not answers. Why must freedom always be traded for acceptance? Why must one's soul shrink to fit into the shape made by others? Ane wasn't rebellious in the usual sense. He wasn't loud or confrontational, nor did he disobey for the sake of ego. Instead, he was watchful, absorbing every command with a soft smile while gently stepping around it like a dancer dodging broken glass. His real revolution was silent. He had learned from nature. Birds do not ask permission to fly, rivers do not apologize for carving paths through stone, and the wind does not explain why it shifts directions. He lived with his grandfather, an old man who had once fought for India's independence and had since taken to gardening and writing poems in the dust of his veranda. Freedom, his grandfather often said, is not something anyone gives you. It's something you take back, piece by piece. Ane grew up with that sentence like a secret map folded in his chest. The first step in Ane's journey to keep himself free was to recognize the cages not made of iron, but expectation. He noticed how people enslaved themselves to others' opinions, how ambition was often just disguised fear, and how even love became a leash when tied too tightly. His schoolmates competed for grades they didn't care about to please parents who loved them conditionally. His neighbors bought new vehicles every year, not for utility, but prestige. And the village temple's priest, once a mystic full of light, now lived in fear of scandal and gossip. Ane promised himself early on, "I will not be a slave to anyone's idea of me." But saying such a thing is easy when one is young. Living by it is far more difficult. After finishing school, he refused to go to college immediately. His family was scandalized. "What will people say?" his aunt cried. "You're throwing your future away," his uncle warned. But Ane had a different plan. He had saved up enough money from tutoring younger children and doing odd jobs, and he left Sarnath one morning with a backpack, a notebook, and a flute his grandfather had carved. He traveled from village to village, offering his services wherever he could, planting in fields, painting walls, fixing roofs. He slept under trees or in strangers' sheds, sometimes going without food, sometimes feasting with kind villagers. In every place he went, he learned something. How to climb coconut trees in Tamil Nadu, how to read stars in Ladakh, how to listen to people's real feelings behind their words in Bengal. He was becoming rich, not with money but with life. There were times it got hard, rainy nights where he shivered through cold floors, days of hunger that clawed his belly, loneliness like a ghost at his back, and doubt, oh the doubt, it whispered, "Go home, give up, settle down." But Ane would sit quietly, remember the stories his grandfather told of freedom fighters imprisoned and tortured but unbroken, and he would whisper back, "Not yet." In a remote forest near the border of Nepal, he met an old woman named Kanti who lived alone and grew herbs. She took him in for a week and taught him about silence. "Most people fear being alone because they have never met themselves," she said. "If you want to stay free, you must become your own favorite company." Ane would remember those words often, especially during the years ahead when he would live among crowds yet still feel alone. As the years passed, Ane did settle, but not into what others expected. He created a small home for himself in a hill town where he ran a school that didn't have grades. Children learned through stories, music, farming, and nature. Some parents protested at first, but when they saw their children coming home curious, kind, and fearless, they changed their minds. Ane had kept himself free and now was teaching others how to do the same. But freedom is not a one-time achievement. It is something one must protect daily. Every time he was tempted to expand his school for fame, he resisted Aum. Every time a politician came offering funds in exchange for favors, he declined. Every time a parent tried to dictate what he should teach, he gently reminded them, a tree grows best when you stop pulling at its branches. One day, many years later, Anai returned to Sarnath. His hair had turned silver, his face lined with sunlight and hardship. His grandfather had passed, but the garden remained, wilder now, filled with birdsong and memories. Villagers greeted him with both respect and curiosity. You did something different, they said. We didn't understand it then. He smiled. You don't have to understand it, just live it. And live it they did. Over time, inspired by Anai's story, more young people chose unconventional paths. Some traveled. Some stayed but started teaching, healing, or building in ways that brought joy instead of obligation. The idea of freedom began to spread, not as rebellion, but as responsibility. The responsibility to live your truth without harming others. The courage to say no when the world pushes you toward yes, and the wisdom to know that no one can chain a soul unless it agrees to wear the collar. Even in his old age, Anai kept walking. Every season he would journey to new towns, speaking not with microphones but through music, stories, and silent listening. And every person who met him came away changed. Not because he preached, but because he lived as though life was enough just as it is. In his final years, when asked by a young boy how to stay free forever, Anai smiled and replied, just ask yourself every morning, am I living someone else's story or mine? And if the answer is someone else's, begin again. Every day is a chance to begin again. The young boy who had asked Anai that question, his name was Arav. He was only 12, with bright eyes that mirrored the sun and a restlessness in his legs that couldn't be contained in school books or small village lanes. After hearing Anai speak those words, Arav couldn't sleep for nights. He lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above his bed, wondering what it meant to live someone else's story. He had always assumed that life simply moved in one direction: birth, school, job, marriage, old age. But now something new had cracked open in his mind. A possibility. A choice. In the weeks that followed, Arav began to watch the world differently. He noticed how his father came home from the fields every evening, shoulders drooping with a weight that wasn't just exhaustion. He saw how his mother always looked at their neighbor's concrete house with longing, and how his older brother had given up his love for drawing to work at a shop because drawing doesn't feed a family. And then he began noticing his own thoughts. Every time he wanted to dance alone, he stopped himself, afraid someone would laugh. Every time he wanted to ask a question, he silenced himself so he wouldn't appear stupid. He began to see that the cage wasn't outside him. It was within. Arav started keeping a notebook hidden beneath his mattress. Every night, he would write down what parts of the day felt like freedom and which ones felt like chains. Freedom, he wrote one night, is when I climb the banyan tree and pretend to be a bird. Another night, chains are when I have to sit still and not speak when the teacher talks nonsense. The simple act of noticing began to transform him. Like Anai once did, he became a watcher, not of others, but of himself. One afternoon when Anai returned to visit the village, Arav waited for him under the old neem tree. He held his notebook tightly in his hand and ran up as Anai approached. I started noticing my own chains, he said without greeting. Anai smiled. And what have you found? That I wear many of them without even knowing. That is the beginning of freedom, Anai replied. Arav followed him that day, not as a student, but as a fellow seeker. They walked through fields and forests saying little. As the sun began to set, Anai spoke. The world teaches you to obey, but freedom is not disobedience. It is discernment. It is knowing when to listen and when to walk away. Most people confuse obedience with goodness and rebellion with freedom. But real freedom is quiet, responsible, and unwavering. As months passed, more young people started gathering around Anai, not in large numbers, never in the name of revolution or ideology. They came seeking something deeper than slogans. They came to learn how to think for themselves, and Anai never told them what to do. He asked questions. What do you truly want? Who are you when no one is watching? What are you afraid of losing if you live your truth? The answers were often slow, difficult, tangled in layers of habit and fear. One girl, Mira, wanted to become a musician, but her parents had already arranged a marriage. When she spoke her truth, the family was furious. But Anay didn't intervene. He simply told her, "Your soul must be worth more to you than your reputation." She left the village 2 months later. Years later, her songs played on radios across the country. She never forgot the man who taught her the difference between being liked and being free. Another young man, Satyam, was caught stealing from a shop. Instead of punishment, Anay offered him work, clearing fields, building fences, planting trees. If someone gives you trust when you expect shame, your own heart begins to trust you again, Anay told him. Satyam grew up to start a center for orphan boys, giving them the same chance he had been given. Freedom, Anay believed, could not be taught in schools or passed by law. It had to be lived into existence, every single day. He often said, "Every time you say yes when you want to say no, you lose a feather from your wings." Years flowed like rivers. Last night, he asked Arav, now a young man himself, to sit close. "I'm not leaving you advice," Anay said. "Only a question. Ask it every morning. What am I choosing today? Comfort, approval, or truth? And whatever your answer, let it be yours." Anay passed with a smile, but he did not vanish. His story spread like wind, not as biography, but as spirit. People didn't remember dates or details. They remembered how he made them feel unafraid, how he reminded them that no permission is needed to live honestly, how he proved that a free person, even one, is more powerful than 1,000 followers. Arav took up the path, not to mimic Anay, but to keep walking in his own way. He didn't start a movement. He simply became a living example. He married not for status, but for joy. He raised children not to obey him, but to ask questions. And he ran a small printing press that published stories, poems, and essays by unheard voices, women from rural homes, tribal elders, children. The press was called Feather of the Wind, named after Anay's old saying about the price of truth. In his own time, Arav became an elder too, and one day, a child in his village asked him, "How do I stay free in a world that wants me to fit in?" And Arav, remembering the neem tree, the silence of forests, the fearless eyes of Mira and Satyam, and the last words of Anay, replied, "Be brave enough to be alone. Be soft enough to feel everything. Be bold enough to walk away. And every morning ask, is this my life or someone else's story I'm living? And if it's not yours, my child, begin again." Time, like the breeze on a quiet hill, passed gently and without announcement. Arav aged slowly but surely, his shoulders gaining strength, his voice deepening, and his gaze sharpening with each year. But he never allowed himself to harden. Even when the world tried to wear him down with disappointments, betrayals, and the heaviness of responsibility, he returned again and again to one guiding truth. No one can cage you if you refuse to hand them the keys. His home became a sanctuary, not just for himself, but for anyone seeking a different rhythm of life. Some came broken, failed artists, disillusioned teachers, laborers who had been exploited, widows discarded by their families, and even a former politician who had walked away from power after realizing that his speeches were emptier than silence. In Arav's presence, they didn't find answers, but they found the permission to be confused, to heal, and to begin again. Freedom isn't the absence of pain, Arav would say during their quiet tea sessions. It's the presence of dignity, even in pain. He grew vegetables in his backyard. He repaired his own shoes. He learned to stitch. He spent mornings in silence and evenings reading books written by those whose voices had long been buried, letters from prisoners, journals from wandering monks, songs written by field workers. And through it all, he remained deeply alert to one thing: the subtle return of the old cages. One of the most dangerous cages was pride. Once, when a group of young followers tried to publish a book about his life, he told them gently, "Don't write about me. Write about the questions that keep you awake. If I become a statue, you'll start worshiping me, and then I'll be another chain around your ankle." They obeyed. The book was never published. Instead, they made a collection of questions, dreams, and unformed ideas, and called it Paths Yet to Be Walked. That book spread quietly, passed from hand to hand, especially among college students, prisoners, and those who sat in silent rebellion during long family dinners. One day, a young woman named Nisha arrived at his doorstep. She was furious at the world. She had spent a decade building a tech startup that had made millions, only to realize she felt emptier with every success. She quit, shaved her head, and wandered for 6 months before hearing Arav's name in a tiny library in Pune. She expected answers when she met him, but Arav only smiled and handed her a broom. "Clean the yard, then we'll talk." After an hour of sweating in the sun and silently watching ants move through the dust, she returned, breathing slower, a little less angry. "Why did you ask me to do that?" she asked. "To remind you that the world does not revolve around your story," Arav said. "When you forget that, you become a prisoner to your own ego." Nisha stayed for 2 years. She helped build compost toilets, wrote stories about sanitation workers, and learned to cook without recipes. She found a joy deeper than success, one rooted in usefulness, not validation. And when she finally left to start a center for healing in the city, she bowed not to Arav, but to herself, to the version of her that had refused to be caged by her own ambition. Arav never lectured. He lived. And in living truthfully, he gave others a mirror in which they could see their own chains. But freedom, even for someone like Arav, remained a daily negotiation. When he was offered a national award for social impact, he declined. "Even gold becomes a shackle when you forget how to let go," he wrote in a letter. His refusal made headlines. Debates erupted. Was he arrogant or truly free? But Arav didn't respond. He spent that evening planting tulsi and writing letters to schoolchildren about the power of listening. He remained free by remembering the cost of his freedom, every friend who had misunderstood him, every opportunity he had walked away from, every comfort he had chosen not to pursue. He was not free because he had nothing to lose. He was free because he was willing to lose everything to keep his soul intact. He kept no disciples, accepted no titles, and never created an organization. He said, "If I build a structure, people will fill it with rules. Then they'll fight over who owns it. Better to remain a moving river than a stagnant lake." Still, his story spread, and because he refused to brand himself, his name became folklore. Children in faraway towns whispered stories about the man who taught freedom by sweeping leaves. Artists painted his silhouette under banyan trees. College students quoted him during protests, and in prisons his sayings were carved into walls. But Arav knew that fame too was a trap, so as he aged, he quietly withdrew. He began speaking less. He traveled more anonymously, often disguised as an old sadhu or a village trader. He wanted to observe without being observed, to learn once again what it meant to be invisible. He visited remote mountains, sat in silence in tribal huts, and once spent 6 months as a fisherman's assistant on a coastal village where no one knew his name. It reminded him of his youth, of the first days when Ane had walked away from expectation. And in that anonymity, he found something purer than freedom, belonging not to a society, but to the earth itself. One monsoon evening, as he sat watching clouds roll over a green hill, he wrote in his journal, "To stay free, one must never become too sure of themselves. Certainty is the rust on the chains. Doubt, curiosity, silence. These are the friends of freedom." He returned to his village for the final time in his late 60s. Slower now, his bones whispering of time's passing, but his eyes still sharp as wind. He lived in a small hut near the edge of a forest with no electricity and only a few books. He taught no one. People came hoping for wisdom, but he only asked them questions. One man came and asked, "What is the key to a happy life?" Arav replied, "Why do you want happiness instead of truth?" Another woman came and asked, "How do I free my children?" He said, "By first freeing yourself from needing to be their savior." They returned home, sometimes frustrated, but often transformed, not by his answers, but by the space his presence created for them to find their own. And in that quiet, wordless living, Arav faded into legend. Not because he did great things, but because he reminded others they could. Years passed like a silent river. Arav's body grew slower, his skin lined with sun and time, but there was something increasingly transparent about him. He seemed to carry no resistance, no inner argument, no weight of self. In his final years, he stopped speaking in long sentences. He would smile more than he would answer. And when people sat with him, they found themselves growing quiet. Not out of fear or respect, but because silence near him felt like truth. Eyes soft, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't try not to become them," he said. "Just become yourself. That will be enough." The boy cried that night. Not loudly, not in grief, but in a quiet release of something held in too long. He stayed in the village for weeks, helping elders carry water, painting walls, learning to cook. He stopped trying to explain himself. He started learning to feel. Arav had become like a mountain, not needing to do anything to shape the landscape around him, only needing to exist in his full, honest being. People left his presence lighter, clearer, more confused sometimes, but always a little more themselves, and he gave no credit for that. He once said to a traveler, "If your heart opens near me, it is because it was ready. I only hold the mirror." But life, even one as simple and whole as Arav's, must return to its source. One morning, a faint cough lingered too long. By noon, he could barely stand. He sat under the neem tree, the same one where he once met Anae, and looked up at the leaves swaying against the sun. A gentle breeze moved through his hair. A group of children came and sat around him, without needing to be called. "I think," Arav said with a soft smile, "this might be my last breath in this body." The children didn't panic. They didn't cry. They simply held his hands, one by one. He looked at each of them. "If ever you feel afraid to be who you are," he said, his voice like the fading wind, "just remember, I did it, and I wasn't anyone special. I just didn't lie to myself. Don't lie to yourself, and you'll be free too." With that, he closed his eyes. His breath slowed, then paused, and like a feather carried by the wind, his soul drifted away, not loudly, not with ceremony, but with the peace of someone who had fulfilled his only real duty, to live as his soul demanded. There was no funeral. There was only a circle. People gathered, quietly. Some sang, some sat in silence. Some read aloud from the letters he had written, and someone placed his old torn shoes on a small stone with a single line etched below. He walked without chains. But Arav was not gone. The seeds he had planted were not in soil, but in minds, in the quiet courage of hearts he had touched. Across cities and villages, small ripples of his freedom began to take form. A student who had once sat with him started a traveling school that taught children how to think, not just obey. A woman who had been afraid to leave her abusive husband finally walked out and began working with other women in shelters. A government officer who had once sought promotion after promotion chose instead to expose a corrupt scheme, even though it cost him his position. And Ravi, the boy who had come running to the hut, grew into a teacher, but not a teacher of subjects. He taught questions. In his little open-air classroom under a tree, he taught children how to notice their feelings, how to speak their truth, how to say no, how to sit with discomfort, and how to walk alone when necessary. Every morning he wrote a line on the blackboard. Is this your truth or someone else's? He had no photos of Arav. He never needed them. The lessons were carved into his being, not his walls. Years went by, and the world, as it always does, changed and changed again. Technology advanced, politics raged, markets crashed and rose. But underneath all the noise, a quiet lineage of the free continued to grow. It had no leader, no banner, no website. It was invisible to systems, but alive in souls. A carpenter in a small town refused a contract that required cutting down sacred trees. A dancer in a city gave free lessons in a slum every Sunday. A monk who once took vows in fear left his order and chose love over dogma. And in a coastal village, a group of fishermen who had been cheated by middlemen banded together to form their own cooperative, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. These were not revolutions, they were revelations of what happens when even one person refuses to live in fear. And so the story continued. Not in the pages of history books, but in whispers, in choices, in pauses between decisions. One might ask, how do you keep yourself free? And the answer, as Arav lived it, is not a doctrine. It is a daily act of remembering. Remembering that silence is not always surrender, and that noise is not always courage. Remembering that being misunderstood is not failure, and being praised is not success. Remembering that you are not your name. Not what is polite, but what is true. You unlock the invisible door that leads back to yourself. Arav may have left his body, but his life proved one thing clearly, that the most powerful rebellion in this world is a quiet one, the rebellion of a free soul who simply chooses every day not to be a prisoner. Not to the past, not to fear, not even to identity, but only to the truth that rises within like the morning sun, soft, steady, and eternal. Thanks for watching. Please share this video